Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Anthropology 333, Anthropology of the Developing World. This week, we're going to take a look at Chapter 10 in Bodley with the political struggle for indigenous self-determination. So in this chapter, Bodley revisits the question of who are indigenous people, and he looks at this definition from a number of different sources, both from indigenous people themselves, as well as international groups like the United Nations. And so in this context, Bodley proposes a new definition of indigenous people, one based on the World Council of Indigenous People. They claim that indigenous people is a self-designation of individuals and organizations involved in a political struggle, and that ultimately, whoever they say they are is who they are. The World Council of Indigenous People, or the WCIP, in 1977 declared only indigenous people could define indigenous people. So, from this perspective, indigenousness is a self identification, not something imposed on groups by the state. An alternate definition of indigenous people can be drawn from Jose R. Martin Cobo's study on the problem of discrimination of indigenous populations. In this study, Cobo defines indigenous people as those who A. occupy the ancestral lands, or at least part of them, B. have common ancestry with the original occupants of these lands, C. share culture in general or in specific manifestations with these groups, D. speak an indigenous language, E. reside on certain parts of the country or in certain regions of the world, or F. with other relevant factors. Similarly, the 1995 United Nations Working Group on Indigenous People defined indigenous people as those who have priority in time with respect to the occupation and use of a specific territory. Again, this definition draws on self-identification as well as recognition by groups or other state authorities as a distinctive collective. And finally, these groups suffer a number of negative consequences due to their indigenous status, such as subjugation, marginalization, dispossession, exclusion, or discrimination from the colonial state. But these formal definitions ignore the specifics or indigenous culture and society that matter to indigenous people. Instead, the details that matter are the social and power relationships to the household, the importance of community, as well as the humanizing process. And so, after revisiting this definition of who are indigenous people, Bodley next turns his attention to political movements around the world by indigenous people to gain self-determination. And Bodley begins by pointing out some of the struggles that indigenous people face in the political arena. He claims that indigenous people can easily be overwhelmed by the political struggle against them because they lack the power to adequately defend themselves and their human rights against dominant society. This is because indigenous people often face many challenges to consolidating their power, including being numerically weak, having to combine with previously hostile groups, having to win allies within the dominant society, as well as having to win allies internationally. But despite these struggles, today, indigenous people are consolidating their power to fight for their rights and maintain their way of life through the lens of self-determination. And so for the remainder of the chapter, Bodley takes a look at some case studies about the political struggle for indigenous self-determination. And in these movements, he defines a few common characteristics. In these struggles, indigenous leaders of self-determination movement often have a clear conception of who indigenous people are. In these struggles, self-determination is a common theme, as is control over their ancestral homeland. And the first case study Bodley introduces is that of Nunavut, an indigenous majority territory created in Canada in 1999. The indigenous people of the far north of Canada, known as the Inuit or the Eskimo, began advocating for their traditional homelands in 1976 as a way of gaining self-governance over this territory. In 1982, a final agreement was made with the Canadian government to carve out a new territory in the Canadian North known as Nunavut. This agreement gave the indigenous people of the Canadian Arctic $840 million over 14 years in compensation, as well as mineral rights to 14,000 square miles of land and direct title to 136,000 square miles. And finally, in 1999, the Inuit-governed territory of Nunavut was created by an agreement with the Canadian government. In 2003, the Nunavut Economic Development Strategy was issued, with the goal to create sustainability with small-scale values in a globalized world. And this program emphasized sustainability, self-reliance, environmental stewardship, traditional knowledge, and social equity. And you're going to have the opportunity to learn a little bit more about Nunavut this week in one of our videos that I posted to Blackboard. And the struggle for indigenous self-determination wasn't just limited to Canada, but we see a similar movement happen in the United States in the last half of the 20th century with the American Indian Movement, or AIM. The American Indian Movement, or AIM, was formed in 1968 as an advocacy group for Native people in the United States. During the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, the American Indian Movement was instrumental in creating a source of Native American pride in the United States through a movement known as Red Power. This culminated in direct action, such as the 1969 through 1971 occupation of Alcatraz Island, as well as the 1973 Wounded Knee incident. Wounded Knee was the site of an 1890 massacre of Native Americans, and in 1973, the AIM occupied the site for 71 days, ending in a standoff with the FBI, which electrified the Native American community. And beginning in the 1980s, this group began to shift from direct action to international cooperation as a way to recognize Native American rights within the broader struggle of the indigenous movement around the world. So this week, you're also going to be watching another video on the AIM's occupation of the Alcatraz Island put out by the National Park Service. And you're going to have an opportunity to hear firsthand from some of those people who occupied the island and understand what they were going through and what their goals and motivations were. Another case study we'll discuss this week is the Maya Leaders Alliance of Belize. The Maya Leaders Alliance in Belize works to promote the long-term well-being of the Maya people, as well as to defend their collective rights to their territories. And the Maya Leaders Alliance was instrumental in a series of court cases in the early 2000s, in which Maya people argued that they had rights to traditional homelands as well as communal property. And in 2015, the Supreme Court of Belize granted 39 Quechua and Mopan Maya indigenous communities in southern Belize with the rights to their land, and that they have always historically occupied and used. And this granted them the ability to set land tenure in a traditional fashion, separate from those of the state, as well as providing increasing self-governance to the indigenous people of the region. And again, I've placed some videos on Blackboard to teach you a little bit more about the Maya Leaders Alliance and their struggle and through the court system to gain rights to their land. Another case study we'll discuss this week are the Kuna people of Panama. Kuna people are indigenous to eastern Panama and live along the coast of the Caribbean Sea. Following a weak Panamanian government in the early 20th century, in 1925, the Kuna broke apart from Panama and declared their independence as a new nation. But this autonomy was short-lived, and the Panamanian government used military force to take over the area. In 1930, the Kuna were granted more autonomy within their region, and the new territory is known today as Comarca Kuna. Within the present government of Panama, the government treats this area as a province, but for the Kuna people, they see it as their own government. And in 1995, the Kuna formalized the Kuna Norms of Fundamental Law, which normalized their culture in the eyes of the law. And indigenous control of their homeland has also been instrumental in maintaining this fragile ecosystem. As of 2004, the Kuna have recorded a very low rate of deforestation, only about 0.2% per year. And the Kuna credit their indigenous self-rule as instrumental for their ecological protection, as well as maintaining their culture to pass on to future generations. Another case study we're going to take a look at this week are the Shuar of Ecuador and Peru. The Shuar are a really interesting group because even though they were conquered by the Spanish in 1540, they kept much of their autonomy until the mid-20th century. It was only beginning in 1959 where they began to rapidly lose their way of life to outside forces. But beginning in the 1960s, the Shuar gained rights to their land, and by the 1970s had gained over 95,000 hectares of land within their indigenous homeland. And in the 1970s, the Shuar Federation created indigenous schools to teach about their culture and way of life to the youth. And in Amazonia, this is a particularly interesting case because the Shuar are the first indigenous people to effectively regain control of their autonomy after being colonized by outside forces. And they've become a model or an example for other indigenous populations around the world. This week, we're also going to be looking at a case study from Asia, the tribal populations in the Philippines. These indigenous people in the Philippines have been resisting colonization for over 400 years by retreating up into the mountains. But today, they are impacted and have nowhere else to go. So in order to maintain their autonomy, the Filipino tribal people have been burying their internal differences and mounting a campaign of resistance against the colonial government. And this resistance took on new urgency beginning in 1973 when the Filipino government began to construct large-scale dams that would have flooded their territory. These indigenous people tried many methods to prevent the loss of their lands and the destruction of their habitat, including sending delegations to the Filipino government. These efforts were rejected. In response to this rejection, in 1976, the indigenous peoples of the Philippines made a formal declaration. They wanted to maintain their land and autonomy away from the colonial government. But the colonial Filipino government had no intention of backing down. And in the late 70s, armed conflict broke out in the region between the national government and the local tribal populations. During this time, indigenous villages were relocated, as well as indigenous political leaders were arrested or even assassinated. And it was the assassination of one of these leaders that brought together more than 300 representatives and 23 tribes of these indigenous people to form the Cordillera Alliance. And it was this alliance of indigenous people which not only stopped the dams on their homeland, but helped bring down the dictator government of the Philippines at the time. And while the indigenous people of the Philippines have gained more autonomy in recent years, still problems remain. And today, the Cordillera Alliance continues to protect indigenous people in the region from the impacts of outside development. And indigenous resistance to colonialism and the fight for self-determination isn't located in just one particular country. And to finish up this week, we're going to be looking at cases of international cooperation between indigenous groups around the world to advocate for their rights. The coming together of a large number of indigenous groups within a global arena to fight for their common rights is a relatively recent phenomenon. The first instance we see of this really is in 1975 with the World Council of Indigenous People. The World Council of Indigenous People, or WCIP, has a number of different goals, including to ensure political, economic, and social justice to indigenous people, as well as to establish and strengthen the concepts of indigenous and cultural rights. The WCIP is actively participating in public policy, along with many other indigenous organizations today. And another one of these venues for international cooperation for indigenous people is what's known as the Arctic Council. The Arctic Council was the first international organization to include indigenous people in its founding documents. It was formed in concern with threats to the Arctic environment, especially those brought about by climate change. And the purpose of the Council is to promote environmental protection and sustainable development in cooperation with indigenous people, who are often most impacted by climate change. And the Arctic Council has been instrumental in helping to preserve their environment as well as their way of life. And the final area we're going to take a look at for indigenous cooperation on an international scale is with the United Nations, specifically the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, or UNDRIP. And you're going to have a chance this week in your homework to take a look at the UNDRIP and answer some questions about it. The UNDRIP was created in 2007 in conjunction with hundreds of indigenous groups around the world. This document stressed many important indigenous rights, such as the right to self-determination, the rights to their land, territories, and resources, the rights to compensation for resource confiscation, the prohibition of forced assimilation, and the forced removal of their own lands. And this resolution was adopted by the United Nations with only 4 countries voting against it: the United States, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. And so based on what you read this semester, you should think about why those 4 countries might have been opposed to this declaration. Well, that's going to wrap up this discussion of Chapter 10 in Bodley, the political struggle for indigenous self-determination. As always, if you have any questions about the materials we read this week or any of the assignments, please feel free to contact me and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Thanks so much for stopping by, and I'll see you next time.